Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, University of Austin economist and former congressional staffer Tim Kaine, and political scientist Michael Levy. Hi, guys. How you doing this morning?
Good morning. Good morning, Mike. Good morning, Tim.
So, it has been another busy week, but before we get to all the big things that happened that week, I want to thank Judy, a new Patreon supporter who took advantage of the yearly pledge discount of 10% over month-to-month support. Judy, thank you very much. We really do appreciate your support. And as always, if you want to be a Politics Guys supporter, support links are always in the show notes. All right, so we will open with the government shutdown now in its fifth week and almost certain to become the longest shutdown ever, barring some bizarre miracle that would surpass that 35-day mark from Donald Trump's first term in office. Both Republican and Democratic senators have ramped up their discussions about ending the standoff in the face of what was an expected suspension of SNAP food benefits today until a federal judge intervened and ordered the administration to use the emergency funds Congress had already appropriated to pay for at least partial benefits this month. Now, the administration was arguing that it didn't have the authority to use those funds, which honestly might be the first time I've heard the Trump administration argue that they've lacked the authority to do anything. And I got to say, they're taking such a narrow view of the term emergency in this context when their view has been, let's just say, a little expansive when President Trump actually wants to do something. Well, all I can say is my eyes were rolling when I heard about it. Now, the Congressional Budget Office to this point estimates that the shutdown has already resulted in economic losses of from between $7 and $14 billion, with a potential GDP reduction up to 2% for the fourth quarter. And, while it's good, I think, that senators are talking across the aisle, they can't do it in the House because they've been out for like 40-something days. But anyway, more on that later. These talks tend to bog down, if history's any guide, though I think with pressure continuing to mount, it's hard, at least for me, to imagine this going on for much longer, though. With President Trump, I've learned that plenty of things that were hard for me to imagine, including President Trump, end up happening. I should also mention that another big thing happening today, November 1st, is the beginning of ACA marketplace enrollment. Democrats are counting on millions of Americans going online to choose a plan, freaking out over how much higher new rates are, and then putting a ton of pressure on Republicans to extend those subsidies until after the midterms. Now, Republicans, by contrast, are sticking with their Democrat shutdown narrative, which, has the benefit of being true. Not that that seems to matter much anymore in Washington. And kind of hoping that increased pressure from federal workers' unions and many problems created by an extended shutdown will force enough Senate Democrats to support a clean CR without any ACA subsidy extensions. Late this week, President Trump called for Senate Republicans to end the filibuster to get this done, writing on Truth Social in all caps, so you know it's important. The choice is clear. Initiate the nuclear option, get rid of the filibuster. But I think in this case, it's highly unlikely that Donald Trump will get what he wants because shortly after that, the day after that, Majority Leader Thune wrote on X that the filibuster forces us to find common ground in the Senate. Power changes hands, but principles shouldn't. I'm a firm no on eliminating it. So, Tim, I'll start with you on this one. What's your take on the last week of the shutdown? I think particularly any economic effects, since you are our resident economist.
I do think there'll be economic effects, but honestly, I don't expect them to be large, not with the scale of trillions of dollars that are sloshing around. And it's funny. I was at a Halloween party last night and was thinking about this show. So I'm waking up with a lot of chocolate in my system right now, guys. But people were really upset. I was sort of surprised, sort of talking to the general public, getting outside of my university bubble. And someone was in my face saying, children are going to starve because of Republicans. And I thought, oh my gosh, here we go. Like we're spending $2 trillion more. It's actually, I'm sorry, only $1.9 trillion deficit expected this year of money that we don't have, meaning the government. And so it's on programs like SNAP and paying for federal workers and the U.S. military. Something's got to give. And we're talking about a small holdback. This is the kind of pain that a real fiscal crisis might look like. Just a small element. So I don't think it'll be that big of a deal economically, because I do think it'll get resolved. I think there might be an election in a day or two. And so after that, right, nobody wants to look like 3 days before an election that they caved. And so you want to get your workers out. You want to get people motivated. Even though it's an off-year election, you do see some pretty big stakes in Virginia, in New York City. So I think you'll see a lot of action come Wednesday morning this week, and the economic impact will, in the end, be pretty mild.
Okay. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, so I'm glad, Tim, you brought up the election, because I agree, and I tend to agree that after the election is over, we're going to find a way out of this impasse. Probably the Democrats kind of caving, but calling it victory and getting a vote on ACA subsidies. But I'm also glad, Tim, that you brought up the $1.9 trillion budget deficit. And I apologize because, as I said coming into the show, I'm coming in a little bit hot. I had 5 takes for this initial segment. And going with the angriest one, so I'm going to kind of like let it rip, because for me, the whole discussion makes me so angry because it's just total theater. Who wins, who loses, what the polls say. It's all a game of when the fact is that it's real people who are losing. Not Trump, not Mike Johnson, not Hakeem Jeffries, not Chuck Schumer. Right. They'll all be fine. Shutdowns are dumb, full stop. They rely on a legal opinion that's never been tested in court. And Republicans could end this anytime they want. They've let Trump, as you talked about, Mike, in your intro, run roughshod over the law all year in so many ways, shuttering agencies Congress created, refusing to spend money that's already been appropriated by impounding funds, going back through rescissions to cut money already agreed through compromise, engaging in extrajudicial killings in the Caribbean, imposing tariffs at a whim under dubious legal authority, and daring anyone to stop him. And now he's openly calling for the filibuster to be ended. It's the last procedural guardrail in the Senate, but the irony is I actually support that, because that would be a legal way to end the shutdown. I could probably go on for about an hour on this, but I think I'll sort of like maybe make 2 quick points to end. During the shutdown, they found ways to pay the military or ICE, gotten a $130 million gift from a sugar daddy to help pay the military. But when it comes to feeding families through SNAP or keeping people insured through the ACA, suddenly there's no money. And when you talk about like the 1.9 trillion dollar deficit, the fact is 80% of that is interest on the debt, defense, veterans benefits, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. That's $5 trillion if you just add up those things. And we have then, if you take that 80% and you cut everything else, you still have a $600 billion deficit. The Republicans' math just doesn't add up. They always talk about the spending side, but the real problem is on the revenue side. And on the revenue side, we cut agents. We think that there's about $600 billion in unpaid taxes because of lack of enforcement. Republicans then cut the agents that would actually be able to help to claw back that money. So I'm kind of angry, and I'm kind of frustrated, and I'm kind of just coming in hot. So I apologize.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
no.
Tim, Tim, go ahead. Really.
Well, yeah, I don't know what to say. I disagree. I think the Democrats, a lot of this comes back to Obamacare, right? There is a structural flaw in a system that needs such massive subsidies. And it was passed when there was complete control by the Democrats. 60 Democrats put this bill in, and they said it won't cost that much because they timed out the subsidies to end now. And now that the bills come due, they're like, whoa, just give us more money. So I'm completely unsympathetic about to jam in government-run healthcare. I mean, again, I look at things, what's run by the government. Education has a very heavy hand, and that's where we see a lot of dysfunction. Healthcare, very heavy hand. If we really had a free market in healthcare, you'd see better healthcare. If we had fair tax treatment, and Michael, I think you'll agree with me, if we're going to get angry, One of the things that makes me angriest is that we've got gold-plated healthcare plans for wealthy people, and those benefits are untaxed, and poor people just work for dollars with no healthcare at all.
Yeah.
So there are simple things you could have fixed with Obamacare. I've been calling for this for a long time for Republicans and Democrats, and it's just a thicket of mess. And you're right. If you want to, play the games of, well, things don't add up. Hey, man, let's all vote for a balanced budget amendment, right? Let's require the Congress, not next year, over a 10, 15-year period to approach balance. So every year, tighten it, and force legislators to actually legislate. And okay, so let me close on the angry section here. Should we end the Senate's majority rule that you can have a filibuster and you need 60 votes or even more to move anything forward? I've always said no. And at this point, the dysfunction in Congress is so great where we've just got theater and shutdowns. Maybe it's time. We just can't seem to have parties that work together. So let's have it all be, if your team wins the election, they're responsible for the budget. And right now, instead, we've got gamesmanship that just hurts people.
Before I make a more substantive comment about the ACA and the structure of that, because that's obviously a big part of this. Tim, you mentioned that you were unsympathetic about it ending. I wanted to be clear on that, so because listeners might not be clear on that either. Like, for instance, if you are, just to give one example of many, if you're 60 years old, living in Southern Illinois, making $65,000 per year, your average increase is going to be, average healthcare increase without the subsidies being extended, is going to be somewhere around $2,300 per month. That's not per year, per month. I mean, that's an extreme case, but are you saying you're not sympathetic to the people who are going to be hit with these increases? Or I just want to be clear on what you meant by that before we get on to the...
I'm not sympathetic to the budget math, because we're facing a world where you have to choose. You're going to have a future president. It's like, well, sir or ma'am, do you want a military or do you want a Social Security program? I mean, the numbers are so big and the irresponsibility is so big that it's creating a situation where they'll keep Social Security and everybody else gets crushed, where we're counting on government help for our health care. We're counting on government help for SNAP. And I think that future Congress, we're putting them in a terrible spot because we're not being responsible about trade-offs now. I'm very sympathetic with the people. I'm not sympathetic with the dilemma of, Mike pointed out, these things don't add up to that much. I'm like, you're right. And they're all going to go away because they will not touch Social Security. And so I think that's the last stopgap.
Can I make a couple of comments? One is we will touch Social Security, because when we sort of look at this $1.8 trillion gap, and especially when we look at the non-discretionary funding like Social Security and Medicare and interest payments on the debt, and we sort of look at Trump's immigration policies and also just typical demographic trends, that the number of workers that are likely to be taken out of the economy, according to estimates over the immigration over the next 10 years, is about 15 million people. We're going to see a graying population and fewer workers to pay into Social Security. And so we're talking about this $35 billion a year over ACA subsidies, when the fact is we're pushing the can down the road 10, 20, 30 years, when people who are in their teens and 20s, even people like me in my mid-50s, is Social Security really going to be there for me? But last comment I wanted to make on healthcare in particular. I agree, Tim. Obamacare, Affordable Care Act isn't perfect. Nobody claims it is. Premiums are too high. Healthcare costs us way too much money. And to me, as a progressive, it's criminal, honestly, that the richest country in the world can't guarantee healthcare for all its citizens. And so I don't know your guys' status, but as maybe former military, maybe you get some of your benefits through the VA. I get mine through my employer. But what about freelancers, the small business owners, the self-employed? Why should access to a doctor depend on who signs your paycheck? If we were designing a system from scratch, would anyone seriously say, let's tie healthcare to employment, mix in some Medicaid and Medicare, add a separate VA system, and call it all good? No, nobody would design the system from scratch. And the problem is with ACA, when we sort of talked about Medicare for all was on the table, it didn't have the 60 votes to pass in the Senate. They probably could have gotten 51 if there was no filibuster and passed it. And so Obamacare is more of the best deal that Obama could get given the circumstances.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with everything till the end point.
Of course.
Yeah. Of course we wouldn't design this system. Let's talk philosophically. The richest country in the world, can't we pay for people's healthcare? No, we got to be the richest country in the world because we have a smaller government and we're creeping up toward European levels. Look, the richest country in the world, shouldn't the government feed everyone? No. That's not, I don't want to have McDonald's replaced by GovDonald's, right? I think things that are run by the private sector are very efficient. And so what's the problem has been that the government's gotten itself more and more and more involved in healthcare. And it says, everybody shall have to pay together for an insurance plan that covers things you'll never need. So I'm paying for trans surgeries for my kids. No,
Well,
my kids
first of all,
don't need trans surgeries.
if the private sector were so efficient, why are they getting so many subsidies that prop up their businesses from agriculture to the technology sector, et cetera? I mean, I certainly am a free market person within limitations, but to say that the government is inefficient to me is, and I'm not calling you this, but like it's a lazy argument because, of course, Ronald Reagan talked about like the 9 scariest words are like, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you.
Yes.
And certainly government is not as efficient as it could be. Everybody would agree with that. But we've all, or maybe most of us have worked for businesses. Businesses are also not the most efficient organizations in the world.
Well, the good thing is when a business is inefficient, it goes out. Right. And there's startups. We've got this great entrepreneurial culture. We don't have that in the government. When a government agency completely fails, we just keep paying a higher tab. That feedback loop makes it, look at Spain. Look at countries with bigger governments. They have half the GDP per capita that we do. Right. So this measure your economic freedom and look at the sectors where the government's most involved. That's where you see the most waste and fraud and inefficiencies. So philosophically, do you have a right to eat? Yes. Right to be fed? No. They're very different fundamental things. So right to healthcare, right to see your doctor? Absolutely. Right to have me pay for your doctor? I think that's where you start to get into these massive, massive inefficiencies that don't resolve.
Can I ask one question? Then, Mike, sorry to not let you get in here.
Go ahead, guys.
But philosophically, I understand the point. But let me just ask some real question around not paying for people to be able to eat or not paying for their medical care. Let's just say you have a family of 4. Both folks are working full time. Maybe they're in a minimum wage job or just above minimum wage. They're not a high income. And one of their kids has cancer and needs really costly medical treatment. It's on the family to pay the hundreds of thousands of dollars in bills, or do we just let that kid die? And I know that's a really stark and maybe unfair question, but from a philosophical level, how do we take care of those who maybe have disabilities? How do we take care of those who circumstances, their socioeconomic means are just not as great as yours or mine?
Well, it's a great question. I think whenever you put something in this situation of, are you for life or death, right? It's like, oh, shucks, no, what I want to do is take a big picture and the big picture is, when I look back, has life gotten better? There are these 2 parties that are both saying, oh, the good old days, both the extreme left and the extreme right. And they're both wrong. Go back to 1910 or 1950. What was a cancer diagnosis then? For the richest person in America when their kid had cancer, there wasn't a cure. Now we've got tons of cures because we've got some really good incentives in the marketplace. The rest of the world's importing medicines from the U.S., invented in the U.S. So we're doing a lot of things right. But I think fundamentally, framing it as, well, in the end, who pays for the cancer treatment is, I think we'd get an explosion of future medicines if we would have less government heavy-handedness.
But government has given subsidies to those private pharmaceutical and research businesses and researchers to help to fund the research that goes into making those amazing cancer drugs or those amazing vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, this debate plays out. I hear it in the internet all the time. It's like, well, without the government, we wouldn't have had an internet. And that's just baloney. The government did some things with DARPA that created this network, but the network was commercialized starting in the 90s, and the explosion of HTML, internet browsers, having actual marketplace, not just saying Chicago's been nuked, which is what the original backbone was for, but now it's evolved into something more than a tadpole. It's this gigantic whale of commerce that was entirely driven by venture capital, private sector activity. I think you'd see that they're intertwined. I hate hearing things framed as I'm the pro-death guy. I'm not. I think it's the market that's given us these medicines and miracle of cures.
My take on this, and you mentioned that this is a system that is, the ACA system at least, is sort of unsustainable without government support. And I agree, but you can say the same thing for Medicare or Medicaid or the VA healthcare system that takes care of all of my healthcare needs, for which I'm, very grateful. And when you look at the cost, okay, $350 billion over a decade to extend these subsidies. Now, the CBO says this will result in 3.8 million more people being insured by 2035. And if the subsidies aren't extended, the Urban Institute says somewhere around over 7 million Americans will end up losing their coverage next year alone. And that also means that we're going to see job losses. The Commonwealth Fund did an analysis. They said not extending the subsidies lead to hundreds of thousands of lost jobs in the healthcare and related sectors, tens of billions in lower economic growth. I think what tends to happen with these policy debates, and this isn't directed at anyone particular, but just in general, is that when we find a policy that for whatever reason we don't like, we tend to focus on the costs and not the benefits, and vice versa when there's one we do like. But there really are some benefits from this. A lot more people being insured, the economic aspects that I mentioned. And, just like how tax cuts almost never pay for themselves, ACA subsidies don't either. But there is a fairly broad consensus in health economic circles that this spending is at least offset to a certain degree by those indirect economic growth benefits, increased labor supply, higher household disposable income, better health outcomes, reduced uncompensated care costs. There's a lot of things like that. And in fact, the Urban Institute and Brookings back in 2021 did a study finding that for every $1 spent on ACA subsidies, it generated between 20 and 40 cents in offsetting financial growth. And so it's not really $350 billion. In the end, it's a little bit less than that. Of course, again, we all like to do dynamic scoring when it's on the stuff we like, but not so much on the stuff we don't like. Anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and when we take a real example, so, Mike, when you sort of like talk about the benefits, and I get all your points, Tim, and I understand the conservative argument here. But I'll take a friend of mine who's a successful business owner. He's the only employee in his business, has some healthcare challenges. And where does he get his healthcare? He doesn't pay for it. He gets it through his spouse who works for Starbucks. And that's Starbucks' job. And that employer-based healthcare is a lifeline for their healthcare coverage as a family. But if he didn't have that, he might not be as entrepreneurial as he could be, because he might need to go to an employer to go get his health care because of the enormous costs of healthcare coverage.
Yeah, no, I think there's a really fascinating point with some research out of the Kauffman Foundation, and they funded a lot of great research in this area, that more entrepreneurship is the key to our faster growth rates. Oh. It's the key to invention. And we have this great culture in this country, and yet we built a system that's so anti-entrepreneurial. It's called job lock, where you lock people into their job, and it makes it really hard for them when they have any sort of health limitation in their family. They can't afford to leave and start their business. So fortunately, we do have a country where spouses work and they can support one another in these situations. But there has to be a way. I think there will be a way, because Obamacare won't be sustainable fiscally. And so it's going to have to be disrupted in some way. But when that time comes, let's all be united to end the job lock and create more alternatives for people to get cheaper insurance outside of their employer. How does that happen, Michael? I think it happens when you make that tax code switch. When wealthy people see the cost of their insurance, they're like, no, I want something more affordable. Let's all get organized here, and let's get private marketplaces that will offer things that are more affordable.
But we did have that more affordable before Obamacare, and it was catastrophic coverage, which provided much worse health care and had pre-existing conditions not covered, not allowable. And so I would love to see the Republican plan. And I know, in 2017, Trump talked about replacing Obamacare with something that was going to be great and was going to be cheaper, was going to provide amazing health care. And then in 2024, during the election, he said he had concepts of a plan for health care. It's like Republicans have had 15 years to come up with a plan. And the plan mostly is repeal Obamacare, but I don't know what the alternative is. Yeah, if there wasn't an alternative, I could then say, okay, this is a benefit of it, this is a drawback, I can see it, blah, 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 but there's no plan.
Well, yeah, this is not a Republican Democrat thing. I actually was advising the McCain campaign, and I remember they had a convoluted way of dealing with this that I still can't remember how. But it was trying to get at the employer subsidies, the employer-based cost. But they said, let's just give other people more money rather than take away money from people that have employer plan. I think it's got to be simple. Treat benefits as income. The people that are wealthier, the CEOs, they get these really big benefits. Treat them as income. And you see a lot of rationality will come out of that, and we'll raise some money. So, but yeah, you can't say there's no Republican plan. There's got to be a president. It could be a Democratic president in the future, or it could be a Republican president that wants to fix that specific problem. And I think there'll be a lot of good downhill things from that. But you're right. There's not Barack Obama wasn't for it. Kamala Harris wasn't for it. We don't have anybody that wants to fix that biggest flaw in our system.
Yep. We can agree on that.
Well, the one thing we can all agree on is our current healthcare system sucks.
Yep.
Now, on the shutdown, though, can we all look? It sounds like we all kind of agree that we predict it's going to end in the next week or two. Is that about right, guys?
I think so, but who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Yes.
I'm not on the hill like I used to be. That's some of the chatter I picked up, though. But this is driven by extremes in both sides. Neither of them want to lose.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Mike, I was on the show with you, a month ago, and I said at that point that the Democrats didn't really have any cards, and they still don't. I mean, they've been fortunate that the polls, the Washington Post poll had, blaming Trump and the Republicans 45-33, but they have no cards to play. After the election is over, maybe it's going to take a week or 10 days so it doesn't look like it's just on the heels of the election. The Democrats have to cave. They can declare victory because the Republicans said there's going to be a vote on the subsidies, and then we can all go home. Yeah. But as I said at the top with my part is, it's kind of ridiculous that we allow shutdowns. No other governed country in the world. And it's based upon a legal advice that has never been tested in court. I wouldn't actually mind see it. So I'll just give one last thing. As I was at Joshua Tree last weekend, and it was like kabuki theater. They had rangers at, I had to Google to make sure it was open, national park, but they had rangers at the front gate, and they were handing out maps. And then I went to pay, and they said, well, we can't take your money because the government is shut down. And I was like, okay, you're working. I go in free. And then in the end, there's always a ranger where you stop and you show that you actually did pay. They still had somebody manning that desk, and that person was just there to say goodbye. It's like, what is going on here?
Oh yeah, it's sometimes if we had to say between what's more broken, our healthcare system or our government. Honestly, I don't really know, but there's a connection there. But anyway, more on this certainly.
So
well, we'll see.
Mike? Let me just ask,
Tim, please.
I've gotten confused. Is the holdup in the House or the Senate? I thought it was the fact because the House is out of session.
Yep.
I'm still very confused by this, and I think most Americans are. Like, when it starts hurting, then I'll start paying attention. Now it's starting to hurt, and I still can't quite figure out who's the holdup. Why isn't the House in session?
Well, that's a great question to ask. And Mike Johnson had clearly made the strategic decision that keeping the House out will increase the pressure on Democrats to get things done in the Senate because like you said, there's no House doing anything. And I think I certainly find that highly problematic. I'm not one of those people who's saying, I just want that to go back in session so Johnson can swear in that Democratic rep will be the 218th vote for the discharge petition on the Epstein thing, though that will be interesting as well. But, I think it's just, again, Mike Johnson, like everyone else, is playing politics with this. And I think,
so it's another
Michael, you made the point.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, you made the point that for them, it can be a political game. When we talk about winners and losers, the real losers of this thing are going to be those overworked, stressed out air traffic controllers, those people who get reduced or no SNAP benefits. These political actors, you're right, Michael, they're going to be fine no matter what. And honestly, there are times when this stuff happens, I just say to hell with them all. It's really kind of hard to, but anyway.
But Mike, Mike Johnson did say this past week that the Republican members of Congress are doing some of the most meaningful work of their political careers. I don't know what that means, but that's a direct quote from Mike Johnson.
Oh God! All right. Well, why don't we move on from that, from domestic affairs to foreign affairs? What do you say, guys?
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. So President Trump was in Asia this past week, and of course, I'll frame it the way that I'm going to frame it, and Tim, We'll love to hear what you think. But it was part trade mission, part victory lap, and part performance art, stretching from Malaysia, where he signed trade and minerals deals at the ASEAN summit, to Japan for talks on semiconductors and defense cooperation, in South Korea for what he billed as a peace and prosperity tour, where he met with China's Xi Jinping for their first face-to-face meeting since 2019. Stop mixed ceremony with spectacle, tarmac dances in Kuala Lumpur, red carpets in Tokyo, and in Seoul, Trump was presented with a golden crown. Beneath the choreography and the crowns, though, this trip was about leverage. Trump has been touting a set of trade agreements with Malaysia and Cambodia and frameworks with Thailand and Vietnam. The White House has said that they're meant to build resilient supply chains and reduce dependence on China. In reality, they look a lot like old-school deals designed to favor U.S. corporations, opening Southeast Asian markets to American tech, agriculture, and manufacturing giants. In the run-up to the meeting with Xi Jinping, Trump was ratcheting up his nuclear and tariff brinkmanship with Beijing and Russia, threatening to restart nuclear testing on an equal basis. Would love to hear from you guys what that actually means, since I don't think Trump knows, if you listen to his quotations on that. And 100%, and he was threatening 100% tariffs on Chinese imports if Xi didn't agree to what he calls a fantastic new deal. China, before the summit, had hit back by tightening export controls on rare earths, reminding everyone that it still refines more than 90% of the world's supply. But what Trump and Xi did agree to in South Korea appears to be a tactical disengagement rather than a full reset. China will delay its new export licensing regime on rare earth minerals for at least a year, easing one of Washington's biggest strategic concerns. In return, the U.S. will pause its 100% tariffs and roll back part of the fentanyl-linked tariff on Chinese imports, bringing the tariff on Chinese goods from roughly 57% down to 47%. In the end, my spin on it, it's less of a diplomatic breakthrough than a Seinfeld episode. It was almost like, if you guys watch Seinfeld, like Trump and Xi acting as Kramer and Morty, bickering over the raincoat deal. Each was convinced that the other was getting a better cut. You know, they're coming in hot, they're haggling furiously, and somehow they walked back to exactly the same position as where they started. But they did make some progress. Xi and Trump agreed to meet in U.S. and China next year. And so we're back from the brink that, in my view, Trump manufactured. Progressives see Trump's broad trade policy with China, Canada, Brazil, the world for what it is, an ego-driven trade policy masquerading as strategy. But as Trump dances his way through Asia, the real question is, what's the impact of the deals that he did bring home? Is it restoring the status quo, or is it something very different and very good for the United States? And I'm going to turn it over to Tim and get your perspective as an economist.
So I was fascinated. It was a long trip, the 6-day trip for the president. And I think it's easy to get caught up in the details and miss the big picture of, there was a visit to two really important allies. Now, I was stationed in Japan and in Korea, so I have a particular affinity for the importance there. I think we forget, too, that there was a lot of concern there would be a World War III. There was so much animosity in the Pacific between Korea and Japan, which had occupied it, and China. And in fact, instead, we sort of kept the peace, and everybody's thrived for a long time. China converted from communism to now they're even worse, they're capitalists. And so, there's this really intense competition. They have grown dramatically. But South Korea is the real great story. That South Korea was poorer than North Korea back in the 90s, had no industry, literally dirt poor. And now it's one of the richest, most productive economies in the world. And I think that has been built on trade. And so that relationship and what they've negotiated with Trump there, I think, was real. It's to have settled tariffs at a 15% rate, which is not pro-growth, but it's certainly manageable and puts it on equal footing with other allied countries. So I think it was great symbolically. Whenever a president visits another country, they're saying, this is, you matter to us. So it was great to see it included Southeast Asia as well. The tariff regime in general, I'm very skeptical that tariffs are net good for us. If other countries want to have tariffs, it just hurts them. And yet I think a reordering makes sense. And I think this is part of a larger story of a decoupling of China from the United States and from the West, in that COVID sort of taught us what happens if there is another mass critical event and we can't manufacture things at home and we just can't trade because the next pandemic's much more fatal, right? So having onshoring some more industrial capacity, I think, does make sense long-term as insurance. The way we're getting there is incredibly messy. But I was really happy to see the calming of the relationships between our allies in Japan and Korea. I do think there's a lot of theater. I think frankly, this all pans out in, is there a recession next year? Because if there is one, then people will say it's because of the tariffs. I don't know what else they would say. And if there isn't, it'll be a real vindication. We'll get into that with the economic numbers, but I'd say it was a success. It was certainly, I think, Michael, you characterized it all very well.
To me, it seems like we can see a clear pattern here, what President Trump's doing with the tariffs, right? He sets a real big tariff rate, then he uses that, or at least threatens it, then uses that threat to extract some really one-sided concessions from, at least from smaller countries, and then, lower the tariffs rate. And so basically, I mean, you take a look at the Malaysia and Cambodia deals in particular, for instance, they're agreeing to a 0% tariff on U.S. imports, not to adopt stricter stricter safety rules that would affect U.S. imports, and to coordinate with the U.S. on export controls. What are we doing? We're agreeing to give them a tariff rate that's 5 times more than what it was in 2024 for Malaysia and 7 times more than what it was in 2024 for Cambodia. Thank you very much. Now, we couldn't do that with China because, of course, China has some actual leverage over us. And so it seems to me that Donald Trump doesn't really understand how trade works. So fundamentally, he might think we're winning on this, but it sure doesn't seem to me that we actually are at all. But I also say that he's made some interesting deals, and the way he's done his sort of state capitalism sort of thing with Donald Trump in charge has been really interesting. Take the South Korea deal. The South Korea deal, they're going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars, but how that's going to work is that U.S. share of the profits from those investments, that doesn't go to the Treasury. It's controlled by a government investment committee, which is in turn controlled by, guess who? Donald Trump, with no congressional say-so on, again, billions in government allocation. Now, this is probably illegal under something called the Miscellaneous Receipts Act, which requires that miscellaneous receipts have to be deposited in the Treasury. But again, illegal never really stops the Trump administration, at least at first. You can also argue it's against the Appropriations Clause as well. And so we've seen a lot of these deals, which seem to me to be based on a faulty premise about trade, but a very clever premise about consolidating power in Donald Trump.
Well, I think, look, the president's doing a great job of focusing on the real enemy, which is the Canadians. And so I think that's, with the Toronto factions out of control. And there was this was in the news, right? The Canadians put out a ad with Ronald Reagan, my favorite president, talking about how much he hated tariffs, and that upset our current president, and so called off talks. And the Canadian Prime Minister, I think, maybe just apologized, I saw this morning, for the ad. So it was probably provocative. But look, I think the real fault is with economists, right? We're the ones that told people this thing called a trade deficit is actually a deficit. And I've explained this to my students. A budget deficit is when your congressman spends $6 trillion and they only raise $4 trillion, and there's $2 trillion that's got to come from somewhere. A trade deficit is mislabeled. It's like when you go to the barber and you get a haircut and you give him $20 and you leave the store, you don't have a $20 deficit. You don't still owe him any money. In fact, what he's going to do with that money is probably go invest it. And that's what these countries do when there's a quote unquote trade imbalance. They've got extra dollars. We end up having a massive investment surplus into the United States. So it's ironic that the trade deals that are being negotiated have these huge agreements, which that investment's going to flow in anyway. But now it's a little bit more structured. It looks a lot more like industrial policy. I think the legality, Mike, you raise a great point, but I'm not so sure it's a bad idea. Right? So if we do want to have some critical sectors that we advance, we could have a rare earths processing here. It's not that China's got deposits of rare earths that nobody else does. It's that they're willing to do the very dirty, environmentally damaging process. And turns out there's an opportunity to have a very serious conversation with Australia. A lot of land, not very many people, kind of like Nevada, right? That's where we've wanted to put our nuclear waste. So there'll be a new rare earth strategy long term. Even this 1-year pause is probably a win for us strategically. But I do want to keep my eyes on Toronto and hope you guys will join me with focusing on that.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering. I was going to say, I'm kind of wondering from a MAGA point of view, the World Series that's going on. I mean, you can't root for LA or Toronto, like you know.
We need an immigrant to win our World Series for us. Come on, Ohtani.
I guess I agree with you, Tim, that it makes sense to have at least some sort of what you might call an industrial policy when it comes to strategic minerals and strategic sectors. And you can look at this one way, and if you squint enough, you can kind of see a little bit of that, but it's in the details, like that agreement with Japan, okay?
Yeah.
Now, that agreement calls for them to invest $550 billion. Now, supposedly it will be for what are called in the agreement strategic sectors. But if you actually look at the agreement, there's no language in the agreement that limits the projects that Donald Trump picks. And that's how it works, because in that agreement, the Trump administration says to Japan, here's what we want you to invest in. They have 45 days to agree. If they don't, tariff rates can go back up. And so talk about a slush fund to just say, well, what are the companies I like this week? Well, Japan invests $50 billion, invest $10 billion in XYZ company. That, to me, is crony capitalism masquerading as a strategic industrial policy.
But that's also what Trump's foreign policy and even domestic policy looks like. If I just talk about the vibes, right? It's all about rewarding your friends, rewarding yourself. If there's any minor criticism, the Canadian ad, yes, it was provocative. Yes, it was selectively edited for Reagan, but it was 100% accurate. And so you're going to punish mild criticism and walk away from one of our most important allies because your feelings were hurt. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing that depending upon how Trump wakes up, what he saw on Fox News is going to impact not only all of our lives, but the entire world. And I worry about, since we were sort of like talking about the economic report, and I don't know, Tim, we're going to get into it in the next segment, but the tariffs may cause a recession next year, but I'm real worried about the AI boom, because if you look at the S&P 500, 60% of the gains in the S&P 500 for stocks. That's all. Mm-hmm. And if the multiples and the valuation on these AI companies is so high that if there's a bubble that bursts, all hell is going to break loose next year. But we'll get into that next segment.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to say that it seems to me that President Trump would be smart to make as many trade deals as possible before, say, January or February, when the Supreme Court has to rule on that tariff, when we expect them to rule on that tariff case, because my sense is that the more entangled he can get everything, the harder it's going to be for the court to say, yes, we pull back this authority and good luck unwinding all of this, because it's going to be a big, giant mess. To me, the bigger question, when you pull back, Tim, you mentioned pulling back and looking at the big picture, in terms of moving supply chains out of China, when you take a look at tariff rates now, it really, this new regime really does make a lot of other low-wage countries more attractive. I mean, pretty much whichever one you want to pick has a lower tariff rate now than China. And of course, Mexico, for at least USMCA stuff, is basically 0%, right? But even with that, it seems to me that businesses, even though they're starting to diversify their supply chains, I'm betting that we're really going to see more activity or less activity, depending on what the Supreme Court does in February or January, February is my guess on that sort of thing. I don't know. So to me, we really don't know what's going on. And I think other countries negotiating with Trump probably get this too until we have clarity on whether or not Donald Trump even has the authority to impose these tariffs. And certainly there's a very strong case that he just doesn't.
Yeah, but again,
that's a key case.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yep. I would just say that's a really key case, and I think it's sort of more important than what we think. Trade agreements historically were treaties that had passed the Senate. So at that point, it's not up to any president to just say he wants to change it. So I think it'll be fascinating, and I've not read up on the particulars of it. I just think it'll be really important to understand what the games what the rules of the game will be going forward, and that's what they're there to do. I can't wait to talk about AI. I have a very different take, Michael, on that. But I want to not let us leave this segment of the foreign trip without thinking, the big event this week for me was this movie dropped on Netflix called House of Dynamite.
Oh, good one. Yeah, I saw that. Well,
fascinating.
Polarizing.
I loved it. There's some plot holes, and it was very frustrating in the plot structure. But the idea that the nuclear threat has gone away is wrong. And having this rogue North Korean nation that's getting better and better missile technology is terrifying. And I think that if there's one person who could just really shake things up and provide an off-ramp for the dictator of North Korea that, your life does not have to end in the hangman's noose like so many other dictators, I'll make sure of it. So Trump was saying, hey, I think we're going to try to create peace on the Korean Peninsula. And he probably could do it. He has better odds than anybody I've ever seen. I do think the man deserves serious consideration for a Nobel Peace Prize based on what Trump was able to do in the Middle East to finally get an exchange of the hostages that were being held by Hamas and the beginnings of a path forward. So, yeah, I'm really excited about the North-South Korea potential for peace under Donald Trump's amazing, let's shake it up and very heavy-handed involvement.
Yeah. So, well, I just say I think Donald Trump is a fantastic negotiator when he's dealing with someone who is much weaker than he is. But I think he is an absolute horrible negotiator when he's actually dealing with a person of equal or more or less equal strength. I think he gets played very easily. I think he's just incredibly susceptible to whatever the last person who flattered him says. So that's a whole different kind of thing. Right, and we won't get into that. But I just wanted to point out that I think he is so not the thing that he paints himself to be. I think he's a great self-promoter. Certainly, he may be the greatest self-promoter I've ever come across in my lifetime. But as a businessman, I think he's just a disaster. And as a president, I think so too.
And just to your point, Tim, I almost started laughing when you talked about the Nobel Peace Prize.
You shouldn't.
And when we look at what happened in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas, it was a 20-point plan. I'm super happy that the hostages are home. It was, I'm Jewish, as it was the single deadliest day of murders of Jews since the Holocaust. But it's a 20-point plan. Only 1 point of that plan is actually really happening. And the bombings have started. I think it's very unlikely that it's going to provide peace for thousands of years like Trump talked about. And the other deals that he claims, I would give him a Nobel Peace Prize if he could talk eloquently about what he did to contribute to those peace deals actually happening, because I don't think that he could explain what happened.
I think I find it hard to believe this is anything but a success. And without the president's intervention, I don't think Hamas gives up its hostages. So I'm a big fan, and I cannot believe anybody would be on the side of Hamas in this. They attacked Israel. They started a war. They just completely got devastated. And yeah, their own people are the ones that are really suffering for it. But Hamas is a death cult that just needs to be rooted out. And I think the president knows that, and he's working to defang them. So getting the hostages back was such an important step, because if Hamas is going to now try to kick up hostilities again, they can't use the Israeli hostages as shields. Those tunnels are now going to be even more vulnerable. So You're right. It's a 20-point plan. Who knows if we're going to see each box neatly checked, but it's such a massive step forward to finally fixing things, I think, longer term for the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
I think it doesn't happen without the president. Look, here's what people love about the guy. He calls out Netanyahu too. He's like, was very vulgar about these knuckleheads. Like, he's not just full-throated in support of the Israeli government. He'll call them out when he thinks they're wrong. He definitely calls out Hamas and authorizes certain attacks. I think the same thing's happening in Ukraine. He's realizing Putin is just not a good faith actor, and the president keeps siding more and more with Ukraine, authorizing potentially more weapons with longer ranges. I think sometimes you need to have more war to get to peace. And so the Korea situation is a little different. It's a Cold War. There hasn't been gunfire exchange for, more than half a century. And yet it's a much more terrifying standoff with nuclear weapons. I do want to give some props. I hope you guys would too, that I think Donald Trump can shake things up. I've seen Republican after Democrat after Republican go, gosh, this is intractable. What do we do with the North Koreans? Meanwhile, they get closer and closer to ICBM nuclear capability.
Yeah, I couldn't.
Well, I certainly agree that nobody has been able to effectively deal with this, but I feel like that doesn't necessarily mean that some maniac who doesn't really know how to negotiate actually is able to deal with it. But again, our views of Trump as a negotiator are very different.
I'm thinking like, you're on the subway, right? And, if you're acting all crazy, nobody's going to bother you. If you're just sitting there very, very silent and very quiet and you're small, then, maybe if there's a nefarious actor. So, Trump is taking the maniac, insane approach.
Yeah.
And I think maybe, Tim, you're giving him an argument because nobody else who comes after him is going to be as insane or as a maniac as him. So maybe he needs a third or a fourth term.
Trump 2028. There we go. He's got the hats already. So yeah, we're set to go. Hey, listen, guys, I know we want to talk about the AI bubble and the economy. I think it's going to be a longer conversation. So let's switch things up just a little bit. And before we close, I'll get a chance to talk about my favorite government agency. Longtime listeners know that I am a big fan of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. In fact, when my wife Kimberly and I went to D.C. this summer, one of the stops that I so wanted to make that I did make was to go to CFPB headquarters, take my picture there. But what had happened? Donald Trump had removed all the signage, not personally, though that would be something to see. He ordered the signage to be removed from the agency in a typical magnanimous, classy Trump move. But anyway.
I think I liked that photo on Facebook for you, Mike.
Yes, you did. That's right. With me pointing to, all they really had was a tiny little piece of copier paper with Sharpie written deliveries around the back or something like that. It was really pitiful. But anyway, so for folks who don't know, the CFPB was established in 2010. It was by Dodd-Frank, that financial reform legislation. The thinking here was essentially that during the housing bubble, too many people were talked into risky loans, other shady financial instruments while there were various consumer financial watchdogs kind of throughout the federal government, the thinking was that, well, it'd be good to consolidate consumer financial protection into a single agency. And so what the CFPB is supposed to do is ensure that these markets for consumer financial products, that they're transparent, that they're fair, that they're competitive. And in the time they've been around, they've received literally millions of consumer complaints, and they've obtained over $21 billion in relief for consumers. Now, they've got an unusual funding structure. They get their money from the Federal Reserve, not the Treasury. Now, this is subject to an annual cap that's set up in the Dodd-Frank legislation. The most recent caps are around $785 million. So overall, in its lifetime, the CFPB has received somewhere between $8 and $10 billion. So roughly, if you do that math, it's taken its funding and easily doubled it in terms of relief for consumers. But Republicans are not big fans right from the very beginning. They don't like the funding mechanism, which gives, them limited control over the agency. They didn't like the independence of the director, which the Supreme Court overturned in the Celia Law case in 2020. But more than anything else, I think, is just a general dislike of financial regulation, with Republicans essentially saying, hey, CFPB rules mean higher compliance costs for businesses, they stifle innovation, and they make credit scarcer, which I would argue I would say, yes, that's sort of the point, because too little regulation, too much financial innovation, and too much easy credit is what got us into the Great Recession in the first place. But anyway, early in his second term, President Trump's CFPB director ordered that the agency halt virtually all of its pending activities and then terminated around 90% of the workforce. And those terminations were initially blocked by a federal judge who found that, well, you can't just end an agency on your own, essentially. Now, that decision was vacated by the D.C. Circuit in August, but on jurisdictional grounds, not on the merits. And recently, the acting director of the CFPB, that's also OMB director Russ Vought, told the Charlie Kirk show that there are only a handful of people there anymore. And so they're there, in his words, while we close down the agency, saying that the process would be completed within the next 2 or 3 months. But again, the problem here is that the executive branch doesn't have the authority to close agencies that are established by Congress. And so that comment by Vought prompted 11 Democratic senators on the Senate Banking Committee to send a letter to Vought in which they write, "Your continued attempts to shutter the CFPB are illegal, and American families stand to pay the price." And even though in court pleadings, the Trump administration has denied any plans to actually shut down the agency entirely, Vought has specifically told the CFPB staff to cease all supervision activity, all examination activity, all stakeholder engagement, all pending investigations, all public communications, and all enforcement actions. As far as I can tell, that's literally everything the CFPB does. So, of course, they don't need any people if they're not fulfilling any of their congressional mandate. And so while it may be technically open, it is closed for all intents and purposes. Michael, why don't we start with you? What do you think about this move?
Yeah, so I'll just put it in, I'll be very brief in the context of everything else that we've already talked about today. You know, whether it's USAID being gutted, wanting to fire a Fed board member, the CFPB on the chopping block, or independent watchdogs being quietly starved of staff and funds. It's what this administration has done over and over, dismantling the federal government by decree and daring Congress to try to stop them, which we know they won't do, or daring the courts to stop them. And so far, whether it's on the shadow docket or elsewhere, the court has enabled Trump to pursue the policies. And so kind of like keeps on crossing the line and waiting for that moment when he's not going to be able to. And so, you know, looking at the CFPB in particular, with Russ Vought saying that they're going to close it down, how can they close it down legally? Congress hasn't voted to eliminate it. The Dodd-Frank Act is still law. And so I just don't get it. I sometimes wonder if I'm living in like Superman's bizarro world where the world is turned upside down. And I used to be this person who was bipartisan, who would always look for compromise. And I don't get how you get compromise when one side is just running roughshod over rule of law over and over again. But I'm glad the Democrats sent a strongly worded letter, and I'm sure that's going to get them a lot.
I'll fix it. Oh, yeah. Tim, what do you think?
This is one where I tend to think it's a useless agency. So I'm not interested in keeping it open. I think it came out of the 2008 financial crisis when we know that fraud was happening. It's not like you create a new agency and suddenly there's a place where people can make complaints, and if you don't have it, then fraud's okay. It's not. The existing institutions failed at the time. Congress is still where people should be able to go to make complaints and highlight fraudulent behavior, whether it's by one big bank or one big lending agency. I've always thought it was a massively redundant agency. For me, I come back to, where are we going to spend less money? You know, we're spending $1.9 trillion we don't have. We need to spend less of it. Boy, if we're going to get torn up over the CFPB, then we're not really serious about cutting. So to me, it just registers as a blip. The issues that you raise that I think are more interesting are procedurally, is this the way that we're going to do things? And that's a good question. Congress is not willing to have a real budget, so it ends up being done through these executive actions, which I would strongly prefer it not be done that way. But here we are.
Well, I wonder, though, you make an interesting point, as I mentioned, that there were a bunch of consumer financial protection sort of elements within the government. And it seems to me you're saying, well, why do we need to just create this thing? And I get that argument, but I guess you could use the same reasoning to say, well, why do we need to create a Department of Homeland Security after 9/11? Because we already had all these agencies who were dealing with this thing. And so to me, it's a question of priorities. I support the creation of a Department of Homeland Security because securing the country is the single most important thing the government does, and I want there to be a centralized agency handling that. But I also think that securing American citizens from financial fraud, from big companies who do all kinds of shady things on a regular basis to screw over Americans, That to me is pretty important as well. And I'm glad there's a centralized agency that's doing that. And like I said, $21 billion in consumer relief over a reasonably short period. That's a pretty good track record, I think.
Yeah, and let me just say one thing. I'm gonna give a little rant here, but why this kind of agency is necessary. Just take a look at one small thing: canceling your gym membership. I mean, you can open your gym membership any way you want, but like you look at like a Planet Fitness or some of these, well, you can't do it online. You can't call up, they need you to come in or you have to mail them a letter. It's like, come on. Like, do we need an agency? Apparently we do. That tells businesses that they can't be shady to just keep on making people pay month after month or creating hoops for them to actually pay. Again, that's super tiny, but it's like one of those annoyances. Should the CFPB have to exist to do something like that? No. We should have other laws and other regulations that can govern that. But unfortunately, Congress hasn't legislated to eliminate some of these abusive practices that businesses partake in.
The danger in having a distinct set of agencies that deal with each distinct set of problems is that, if you go to if you say, call the local police officer and say, this gym has defrauded me. And he's like, well, you're going to have to call the CFPB to that. So you get in the wait line, to them. You can't actually get things fixed because there's a central government agency and the gym can say, we don't respond unless we get a letter from. So you're just over bureaucratizing things. It reminds me of this really tragic situation where you have a shooter at a school and a bunch of warriors with guns, and they're like, well, we can't go and save the kids until we get the all clear from this bureaucrat somewhere. We're over bureaucratized, and I'm afraid I think this adds to it. We know that the real cause of the financial crisis was people getting loans that they watch The Big Short. Right? A bunch of people that shouldn't have been quote unquote homeowners were getting loans. The strippers with a lot of cash having 5 houses in Florida. It's going to collapse. The CFPB is not, if anything, going to make it more likely to collapse because now you've got an underfunded agency and everybody's looking to them for answers. So
But it wasn't just the strippers with cash. I mean, I'll take because I was buying a house around that time and I'm fairly conservative in the way that I spend my money and I don't want to have too high a mortgage and I look at what that payment's going to be and thinking about what my long-term job stability is. But I remember I was making whatever $50,000 a year and it was saying I could qualify for a loan of up to $800,000 or something. It's, and so, banks should not have been giving loans out and having very few restrictions, no money down loans. And again, maybe you don't need a CFPB to enact that, but certainly there needed to be some sort of regulations on the banks so that they weren't just making these loans that had very little possibility of being paid.
Yeah, I think that the government was the one that was pushing a lot of this, right? So I think George Bush was talking a lot about an ownership society. Yep. That made sense. But then the word went out hey, get more people to own homes because it has these long-term benefits. And there's times we shouldn't be. There's certain people that at a time in their life, when I was 21, I wasn't ready to own a home then, and it would have ended poorly for me, poorly for the people that were financing it. So, yeah, I think the real problem here was not that we didn't have a bureau stopping Fannie and Freddie and the Treasury and the Federal Reserve all making it easier. We should have just not had Fannie and Freddie and the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government pushing for more people to own homes. It just less intervention would have helped, not more.
All right. Well, guys, I realized that the last time I was on the show, I ranted about having to mow my fairly sizable, I'm looking out at it now, lawn in mid-October. And I don't know if my wife, Kimberly, heard about this, but the latest episode of her podcast, Sustainable Planet, it's all about lawns. I wonder why I said that. Okay, a Freudian slip. Anyway, but she and her co-host, Jordan Dye, who's also a fan of our podcast, they discuss if we should rethink what a beautiful suburban lawn yard should look like and ways you can be surrounded by green in a more sustainable manner, as well as the mental health benefits of reconnecting with nature. So if you want to check it out, and I hope you do, you can, just go to Search for Sustainable Planet wherever you get your podcasts, or you can go to splanetpod.com. And of course, there will be a link in the show notes. All right. Well, that does it for us for this episode. We will be having a midweek show with the great stuff that we couldn't get to, including that talk about the economy and the AI bubble, perhaps. Now, but if there's anything we discussed on this show that you disagreed with or you got a question about, what have you, we would love to hear from you. You can email us, mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us through Facebook or X. We always put links in the show notes. And there is also our Discord for supporters, which I am on that sucker all the time, certainly more than I should be, more than it's probably good for my mental health. But anyway, it's a lot of fun. If you are a supporter, in addition to that, you get ad-free versions of all our episodes. You get the full-length midweek episode instead of just that 15-minute preview, and of course, access to that Discord group as well. And you can support us on a bunch of ways. We have all kinds of options. I mean, you want to just send us send me a bag full of gold. That works out just fine too. We'll take whatever, but all of our support options are there in the show notes, so thank you very much. And if you do want to get that full-length midweek show, but you're not financially able to support the show right now, totally not a problem. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you support the show or not financially, it really does help us out if you can subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you're using, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And as always, before we go, I want to give out a very special thanks to our executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,